Let's have a session with the Tannenbaum and Schmidt Continuum. So the Tannenbaum and Schmidt Continuum is basically just a scale to define how autocratic a manager is or are. More details on autocratic management styles, click the card up there. So basically on one end of the scale, we'll call that 1 for the moment, or theory X it could be, is that managers give no freedom to subordinates. No freedom to subordinates in decision making. The other end of the scale is where managers give lots of freedom to subordinates in decision making, and you could associate that with theory Y. Now remember, theory X is manager orientated and theory Y is subordinate orientated. So that makes sense in terms of the 1 and 7, the two ends of the scale of how autocratic managers are. Now let's go through each of the numbers on the scale so we can understand what they mean. The first is number 1, which is tails. Tails, the theory X side. So tails is when you use an authoritarian management style. The team has no input in decision making. No input in decision making, but this could make sense if you have new workers, unskilled workers, or even untrustworthy workers. And potentially if you have a smaller team, it might make sense. But it might not make sense if you have experienced workers because they become demotivated, skilled workers, committed team. They might just feel that they're just shackled by the fact that they can't make any decision making. They might become demotivated, could lead to absenteeism, could lead to them just leaving the business. So issues with staff turnover there. And it might not make sense if the business is larger. Now that's tails. That's the most extreme form, this side on the theory X side. Now the next one, if we just move 1 in and away from theory X to cells, this is still a pretty authoritarian style. So it's still an authoritarian style and the team still doesn't have input in the decision-making process. But managers will try and sell the decision. Hence number 2 is called cells, not tails. Sales decision in that they will try and sell decision-making to subordinates. They'll try and persuade them that it's the right decision. And hopefully it makes employees feel like their managers do care because they've given them inclusion in the decision-making process. Now let's look at 3, 4 and 5. Sometimes these are all clumped together and they are called consult, but we will go through each of the 3 parts of the consults. Start with suggest. Suggest is that the managers make the decision. They make the decision, but then subordinates are invited to ask questions or discuss ideas within that decision-making process. Therefore, it actively encourages more participation versus the extreme theory X of 1 and 2, the tails and the cells. Therefore, the subordinates can understand the decision-making process better and it's arguably more motivating than number 1 and number 2, as discussed. It also gives more opportunity to workers to get involved because they can start to now, the experienced workers that is, they could pipe up as it were and they could ask a question or discuss a particular idea. That suggests. The next on the scale is consult. So consult is that managers make a tentative decision. Managers make a tentative decision and then subordinates are invited for discussion and debate about that decision-making process and they could potentially tweak that original decision that's made. So they could tweak it and therefore they feel more motivated because they're part of that process. They have influenced even more the policy. They have influenced the decision because they have tweaked it slightly. Then the last bit and the most subordinate orientated of the consult 3 is number 5, and number 5 is that managers explain the issue. They pose the problem to subordinates and then everyone tries to come up with ideas and come up with a solution, but it is the final say of the manager of what that final decision is. That's probably good if you've got a decision that requires experts in certain areas, SMEs, subject matter experts. Maybe the decision requires an IT expert, a finance expert, a marketing expert. So the only way to come to a final decision is allow everyone to come up with what they believe and then the manager makes the final decision. But clearly that is going to slow down the decision-making process. Now let's move on to the last two. The last two to look at are the subordinate orientated, number 6 and number 7. They are absolutely theory Y, they are delegates and abdicates. So delegates is when managers explain the problem to the subordinates and they will also say this is the amount of resources we have available. That could be the finances we have available, the amount of staff you can put on it, the amount of time you have to solve the problem. Managers explain the problem and go, these are the resources you've got. Then the subordinates will make the decision, but management remains accountable for that decision that has been made by the subordinates. Clearly it involves a huge amount of trust between managers and subordinates, but can be very motivating if it works. The last, the most extreme, so the opposite of theory X, theory Y, subordinate orientated, number 7, which is abdicates. Abdicates because managers essentially abdicate the decision-making process. Subordinates would recognise the problem, and then go ahead and solve it. That's different to number 6, where managers explain the problem. And so when you've got this situation, it's clearly full freedom in decision making to the subordinates, hyper motivating if you've got the appropriate skills and the appropriate experience within those subordinates, those staff. In terms of the last thing is that you must remember that still managers are accountable to the ultimate decision that the subordinates have made in the abdicates situation. I hope that helps with the Tannenbaum Schmidt Continuum, and of course I'll see you on the next sesh.